All right, I'm going to get started here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to RSC's first webinar. It's called Recession-Proof, Your Annual Fund. Boy, the timing couldn't be much better on using that title, but we really appreciate everybody being here. It's going to be a good hour. I'll spend about 45 minutes presenting. We'll have some time for Q&A, but let's just go ahead and get started. If your camera and microphone should be disabled, but if it's not, go ahead please and just disable that and make sure that those stay off for the time being. Also, if you have questions throughout this, you can put them in. We've got the chat box notated here, but actually there should be a button that says Q&A. And so if you hit Q&A and type your question in, we'll get to as many of those as we can. And we'll address those again towards the end of our presentation. So a little bit about the firm and about me for those of you who may not know me, but RSC has been around since 2006. We focus on fundraising, coaching, and consulting for arts and cultural groups. And right now we've worked with about 130 organizations throughout the United States, all disciplines of arts, and it's been, it's really wonderful to deal with that. And even in the last 2 years when things have been very difficult, it's been terrific to work with so many of you. So a little bit about me. I've been in the business for 35 years. I had 20 years with large symphony orchestras, and I've been with RSC since launching in 2006. What you'll find from me and in this presentation today is we talk a lot about fundamentals, because that's usually the thing that we either have drifted away from or we never knew in the first place. So I'll be working a little bit on that. But the goals of today's webinar, first of all, is to do a situational review of current conditions. I mean, we are in a unique time. Again, still, I'm not really sure which way to put it, but we're certainly in a unique time. And we're going to look at those. We're going to look at facts and fallacies in today's landscape. There are things that I hear that I don't always believe, or maybe don't believe as fervently as others. Number three, we'll take a look at our best practices. So RSC is a best practice type organization. So what you'll hear me talk about today is really fundamental kind of work, and that's the way we always filter our approach to things, and especially then how we adjust to recessionary inflation, or however you would be comfortable putting it today. And number four, of course, actionable steps for the new fiscal year. So again, very glad that you're here. We're going to look at those areas modestly, deeply, as much as we can in about 45 minutes. And we'll kind of jump into the very first section, which is a snapshot of today. We're going to look at some key areas. And although I'll speak in terms of generality, what I'm hoping is, even if it doesn't specifically fit every situation that you're in right now, there'll be some commonalities. You'll feel that this relates to your organization, some of your work as well. So you survived, and now what? What do we do? Most cultural organizations, they made it through the past 2 years, and they're in all-out recovery mode, which is great. It's great to be back in the halls, back on stage, having museums reopen, have our cultural institutions come back, and the amount of support that came from not just the public sector, but private sector, and as well, the generosity that we saw over the past 2 years was phenomenal. I think we all hate the reason why it happened, but to see why it happened has been pretty phenomenal. And so now being in all-out recovery mode means certain things. We're going to talk about those as we get a little deeper into the conversation. Number two is old industry challenges remain. It's not like we started with a blank sheet of paper and we instantly have a brand new, better business model than we ever had before. But some things have emerged over the last 2 years. And they're not all challenges. We have some stresses, but there's also been an opportunity to grow as an institute, as a nonprofit institution in arts and culture. And there's been some new opportunities that have come up too. And we're going to talk about some of that. And finally, the bottom line is, no matter how much of these previous 3 points apply to you, I think it's pretty clear that for the time being, most arts and cultural organizations are simply going to have to raise more money, likely more than they ever have before. And so we've got to address this issue of how do we do that, given the recent challenges, given these new challenges that involve recessionary inflation. So we're going to define the word. I looked it up in Google, and here's what I found. So the Google says a persistent increase in the level of consumer prices or a persistent decline in the purchasing power of money. That's their definition of inflation, which is accurate, but it's the one I choose to reject because when you look at both those points, it's very, very negative. And if we found out nothing else in the last 2.5 years, it has been that no matter what the condition, people, organizations, and institutions can be very generous. And so we look at it in terms of this is an opportunity for people to give until it hurts. That might bring a chuckle, it might not, but I take it very seriously. It's an opportunity in a time where people aren't feeling good about everything that they're doing, where there are struggles, where there are difficulties. The opportunity to give to something that they care deeply about, that is ever present, whether it's highly, highly conspicuous or not. It's ever present. So, kind of moving into this next section, I told you we talk about things I hear, but I don't believe. I could spend a whole webinar on this, but I'm going to give you 4 points that I hear. First of all, I hear that people have moved on from attending and supporting the arts. I, I don't believe it. I hope you don't believe it, particularly if you're in this industry and you have some level of responsibility to it and funding it and make sure that we have staying power into the next generation. But this idea that people have moved on from attending. Now, we've seen a decline. I know we have. I know that some organizations are still experiencing a decline. We're going to talk about that as well. But right now, even if recovery is slow, it doesn't equate to people being uninterested necessarily. There are other reasons why that could be happening, and some of those we can directly influence. Number two, donor fatigue is real. No, it's not. Stop saying donor fatigue is real. And if you think donor fatigue is real, we really should have a one-on-one conversation. I think organizational fatigue is real, and it's different. And again, we could spend a whole webinar on this. But the idea that people are tired of you, or people are tired of being asked, simply is not necessarily true. They might be more tired of having a one-dimensional relationship with you, that the only time they hear from you is when you ask for money. That is completely different, and you can completely influence that and help bring people closer to your organization so they don't feel anything that even remotely smells like donor fatigue. Number three, inflation curbs fundraising. Well, we're going to see some data here in a moment. You're going to see that it might give it a blip for a year, sometimes two, but it really doesn't curb fundraising. And if we've learned anything in the past 2 years, it's that people and institutions and organizations are generous. So again, while people have to make hard choices about what they give to, that looking at the organizations they truly, truly love and care about, inflation might play into it. Maybe their gifts don't grow as fast, but it really doesn't curb fundraising or the desire to give and be generous, be philanthropic. And number four, the arts can't compete with food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education. Some combination of that, or just social services in general. I hear that a lot. Here's my answer. I don't want to compete with those places. What I'd rather do as an arts organization is complement them. I don't want to compete with them, because if we compete with them, we lose, because those are very important things. Those are basic human needs. What we do as arts and cultural organizations is complementary to those, to build a better community that helps offset these things and support these things. But we're just as necessary in a much different way, but just as necessary as all of these things. So we look for ways to have our message complement, not compete with clothing, shelter, food, housing, education, and so forth. Here are some of the numbers. So if you haven't seen the Giving USA 2021 report yet, which came out maybe 6 weeks ago, something like that, 6 or 8 weeks ago. I pulled a few slides out of that because I thought you might be interested in the trends. I was certainly interested in the trends. And this first one is a 40-year snapshot of total giving. This is to all nonprofits, not just the arts. But you can see at the very top there, we're at 484.85 billion now in terms of money coming to nonprofit institutions. And it was a 4% increase in current dollars due to inflation. So you can see two numbers there listed. You see the inflationary adjusted, you see actual dollars. I'll bounce back and forth very quickly on some of those. But if you haven't, what I'll say in short is, if you haven't seen this report yet, you should get a copy of it. And usually your community foundation would have access to something like that. You may have direct access. A board member may have access to it. But if not, it's like $135, $140 a year to join. Giving USA, and it has a wealth of knowledge. I think it's fantastic. Looking at this, then you can see that total charitable giving has either increased or stayed flat in current dollars every year since 1981, with only three exceptions: 1987, 2008, 2009. Those had very specific conditions, sort of like the year that we're going into now. So, but by comparison, the change between 20 and 21 coming out of the pandemic, that has been lower than the 40-year annualized. So it's topped off a little bit, but it's really that 2-year period was not nearly as volatile. I see that as a hopeful sign. One other thing I'll point out in this is, individuals, foundations, bequests all reached the second highest levels of giving on record in these 2 years. So again, through a very difficult time, we didn't see the bottom drop out on these, where one might even suspect that would be a time when we would see decline and decrease. So that whole fallacy about curbing giving, people retreat from giving, just don't believe that. Here's another one over a 2-year period, 2019 to 2021, and it's taken in 1-year snapshots and then the totality of the 2 years. And you can see that even for inflation adjusted dollars, total charitable giving increased 8.1% between 2019 and 2020, and it only declined very slightly by 0.7% between 20 and 21. Again, not to overwhelm you with the numbers, what I really want you to see here are the patterns that, with very few exceptions, there's almost nothing on the loss line, which is left of the middle. So again, going through very difficult times, very difficult moments, it bears out that we are doing okay in terms of generosity. Now, I know the one that you really want to see, hopefully we'll want to see, is the giving to arts, culture, and humanities over that 40-year period. And again, I won't get stuck on all the numbers, but I think what the most important thing is to look at the trend. Yes, there's a little volatility, and even for inflation adjusted dollars, there's a little bit of volatility, but it's not terrible. And so even if we go into a time when we experience some volatility, history bears out at least, that we're not going to see tremendous dips, tremendous crashes, and that because we're going to need to focus on philanthropy, we can and we should, and it's actually a pretty good place to focus. So the next couple of charts are ones that I made up. So this is now no longer Giving USA. This is RSC and Bob Swaney. This is a common kind of business model that we see going into work with a client, and it's not 100%. It's really pretty close. So we see about 50% coming from recurring annual giving. See about 29%. This is usually with a performing arts organization. We see about 29% coming with earned revenue. There's an endowment draw of around 8 or 10%. Takes 8 or 10% of the budget, I should say. And then there's this anywhere between an 8 and a 15-year hole in the budget that gets plugged by bridge funds and heroic funds. It's okay if you have the funds, but it's really not a great business practice. I think we have comfortably begun to call these deficits, planned deficits in some cases. And so different places call them different things, but it's a budget shortfall. And if it's not taken care of, it's a cumulative budget shortfall over a period of time. And you may not always be able to build a bridge, and you may not always have heroes. So we want to avoid this model as much as we can. We want to try to migrate from it. Here's a model that I think we can move into, that we're actually seeing some organizations and hopeful that we'll move into, knowing that earned revenue is going to continue to need time to recover. And so at least for the next few years, and by that I mean maybe 3 to 5, I would look at rebalancing a model like this, that recurring contributed revenue might be around 45%, that earned revenue was around 35%, that an endowment draw, if we build our endowments substantially, is represents about 15% of the budget. And then we have project and restricted funds. And what I mean by that is that even if it's in the operating budget, you don't do this part until you have the money. You have to have the money first. It's got to be in place. And that can be mission fulfilling. That could be part of the strategic plan. That could be a new partnership or something that emerges. But it only accounts for 5% of the budget. So the risk is really, really low, and the potential benefit is really high. in that it can also introduce restricted funds or even potentially brand new donors into the fold. So again, remember that number. So if we're saying that about 65% here comes from some form of contributed revenue, 35% from earned, that's a fairly good balance, I think, going into the next 3 to 5 years. All right, so we're going to do a poll here, and part of this is I just want to know if what I outlined in terms of a pie looks like your revenue pie as well, or if yours is higher or lower on the contributed side. So let me go ahead and launch this first poll and give you just maybe 20, 30 seconds. It's not tough. So your organization's current income pie is either relying less on fundraising, about the same as the example, or even more on fundraising than I put. Think about that 65% zone. All right, we've got a few more people to answer there. All right, fantastic. So I'll end the poll now, getting the last votes in you want. Now let me share the results. So actually, based on what you're saying here, we're relying even more on fundraising than what that pie looks like. And so um, my guess is that your earned revenue has not caught up to pace yet and where you would like to have it. So fundraising is taking a larger percentage. That may or may not be accurate in every single case, but it's pretty likely in a lot of cases. What it tells me also is that, knock on wood, you've got very strong annual giving, very strong recurring giving, and that you may be doing some special type fundraising as well, or events type fundraising that's helping to close the gap while you wait on earned revenue to catch back up. All right, so thank you for that. Let's go on to our next slide. So how could prolonged inflation affect your organization? So we've already seen, your revenue model is much different in terms of you're relying more on contributed revenue even than what the model showed. So let's look at how could prolonged inflation affect your organization in attendance, which I think we all know now is going to be slower to return in most markets. So that's a real effect on the budget. It's a real effect on mission. It's certainly going to affect giving, which is likely to increase. However, what we're experiencing is because performances or memberships are the feeder into the annual fund, we're seeing more gifts from higher level or higher gifts even from higher level donors than that broadening of the donor base that we all want. So the availability of potential new prospects is actually lower than what we need to have a healthy donor pyramid. So I think giving is going to increase, but it may not be as traditional as we always see. And in terms of human resources, staff, board, artists are just like patrons. They're harder to find, they're harder to get, they're harder to keep, and so we have to try harder in that area. We have to be more competitive. We certainly have to be more vocal. We have and bring in more people. So we're going to dig into each one of these just a little bit more because they are challenges that ultimately affect fundraising. So the patron reemergence, I've touched on a little bit, but the lingering health and safety concerns have slowed patron return. Again, it depends on your market. I won't go into all the nuances, but here's the quick thing that I've noticed, that at least this summer, depending on how well the professional baseball team is doing in a major market, that tells me about what the hall is likely going to look like, or the facility is likely going to look like in that same market for the nonprofits, the arts and cultural organizations. Not always true, but often true. So I'll give you the quick example there. And collegiate sports are the same way. The fuller the stadium, the signal is the more people are out there doing things and moving around and going to see things and re-engaging and taking part of things that they really love to do. And for those that aren't, it's a pretty good sign that there's still some concerns about it. Number two is the expenses, your expenses. So the the good part, I guess, about being in the pandemic was you had a lot more pliability with your expenses. You could adjust. You had to adjust in most cases, in fact. But now that we're back in action, this idea that your expenses have returned to traditional levels is very real. And in some cases, expenses have surpassed pre-pandemic. So now we've had pandemic, post-pandemic. Now we're moving into this recession slash inflation zone, and expenses have already gone up, and it's very likely they're going to continue to go up. So earned income though is not keeping pace. Talked about that as well. So people are out and about, but attendance remains lower than normal. That the other thing to look at, of course, is that for many of us, the most affected demographic in both pandemic and post-pandemic, now moving into inflationary zone, are that demographic is the one that we appeal to most. And some might skew younger, some might skew older. But knowing that your demographic might be more on a fixed budget because they're retired, or they have safety concerns, not just with health, but also with crime, that those are the things that are in their heads, whether it's 100% accurate or not, is less important than just that you have to deal with it as an institution. So the economy and all that goes with, well, I can't get everything that goes with it in one slide, but here are a few things that I've observed. That the current economic climate is curbing participation. Again, I said that earlier that I don't necessarily believe that, but I do think it has some effect on timing, and the kind of messaging that you'll have to provide to make sure that people continue to feel really good about the investment that they're making in your organization. So if we don't do anything, it may very well curb participation. We're going to talk about towards the end those things that I want you to do if you're not already doing them to be sure that this doesn't become a condition for you. The other thing I've noticed is patron expectations, and this is mostly consumers and not donors. So if you've got an orchestra, an opera company, a dance ballet, you've got anything like that where it's performing, and even at a museum, those kinds of things, that when patrons come back, they have expectations that no matter what difficulties you've had in hiring, no matter what new protocols that you might have, their expectations that things are going to be perfect are really, really high, or at least really high for what they remember them being pre-pandemic. And so those expectations remain. And dealing with those is sometimes very difficult, just because you're not able to provide all the same things that you were, and you may not be able to afford all the same things that you could afford previously. Number three is the organizational opportunities are being deeply examined. So, what we're doing in terms of how did we spend PPP, SVOG money, what our commitment is to DEI, and how much money and time we're able and willing to commit to that. How does that align with our market? But they do it takes time to change that. It takes resources to change that, both in terms again of money and time. So there's some things like that to pay attention to. And again, not all of our mission partners, sorry, not all of our mission partners are back at 100% either. So we might have schools that we partner with and other organizations. Those have all gotten really, really difficult right now, and they're not back to 100% either. So the human and financial resources, well, I said it earlier, good help's hard to find, it's hard to keep, it's hard to pay for, and the competition for staff and artists and volunteers at all levels continues to be very, very high. And that's at the same time that expectations continue to increase and costs are going up. And so again, it's one more thing that you have to balance in terms of uh, how do you come out into fundraising from a point of confidence. Artists remain cautious. So I've noticed this, and I'm not going to judge it. I'm not going to judge whether or not they're right or wrong or somewhere in between. But artists have been very, very cautious about returning back into their different art setting, and particularly those settings that interact with other artists and those settings that interact with patrons and audiences and consumers. So that again, it exists. You have to deal with it. Some of the things that dealing with it will likely cost you more time and money, and those things then begin to become part of your case statement of how you'll talk about your institution and the fundraising. Good volunteers are busy volunteers. So Without going into all my thoughts about boards, I will say this, that about 1/3 of a board is really highly active. And that's in any situation, any market. If you've got more than 1/3 of your board that's really active, then you are doing something very, very right, and don't stop doing it. But good volunteers are busy volunteers. They're likely dealing with other institutions like yours that are having similar challenges to what you're having, and they're getting spread pretty thin. And so this idea of saying, how do you keep them engaged and focused on mission fulfillment, and having them focus on areas where they can really make a difference becomes the challenge. So if efficiency, high leverage, those are the kinds of things I want you to start to think about there. Budgets are very tight. Well, budgets are always tight. And, I think we would all admit that, but budgets are particularly tight now, and they may feel even tighter coming off of some of those government granting monies from PPP, that now you've got to earn all of your funds. You've got to get contributions so your budget now is fully back on your shoulders, and your budget's generally at 100% again. So budgets are very tight. Making decisions about what you'll do and when and how to stack that properly, again, becomes part of your case statement. So, sorry, let me go back to this. We're going to have one more poll, and that poll is going to come up here in just a second. So I want to take just a second and focus on fundraising talent. So the question, and I'll launch this, is that finding and keeping your fundraising talent is more difficult than it was in the previous year, less difficult or about the same as it was in the previous year. And you don't have to have a big development staff to answer this question. This can be just your staff. This can be your staff and your board. Just think about the resources that you use to accomplish your fundraising goals. Take just a minute and fill that out. That middle one's looking a little thin. It's not surprising. All right, we'll give you just a few more seconds to fill this out. All right, let me end the poll and I will show you the results. And here we are. So more difficult than the previous year, 52%. About the same, 45%, and a little tiny 3% on less difficult. Whoever you are, keep to yourself, because someone's going to come get your staff. No, they won't. But this idea of it is, and I wanted to see that our assumptions are in line with reality. In this case, of course, they really are. And so finding both paid staff and volunteers and activating them and keeping them has become increasingly difficult. And of course, at a time when we are relying more on fundraising to balance our budgets, while earned revenue resets itself and comes back to full capacity at some point. All right, well, thank you for taking that. I will stop sharing poll. Oh, I might have thrown you out of the whole thing. I apologize. There we go. All right. So again, we've talked about these relief funds, but here's how I viewed them. And at first I wasn't sure. I wasn't really sure, and none of us were, because we didn't know how long the pandemic was going to last. But, it was life-saving for many organizations. It was certainly the bridge fund of all bridge funds, and how it was used. And it came along just at the right time. But the chasm of time itself was much larger than we anticipated. I don't think anybody thought that some markets would be down 2.5 years. And so that idea, it was a very good thing. I don't think it had any ill effects on us in terms of philanthropy. It certainly kept the organizations going, but most of those now have sunset, and we have to get back to doing the more common business model of earned revenue and contributed revenue. And finally, adapting your future budgets has proven difficult. And mostly that's because, again, costs are increasing with inflation and now moving into this recessionary period. Most of you have already approved your budgets. So you'll either have to raise the money to do it, or you'll have to go into a period where you'll need to start to trim your budget some going into what'll likely be fiscal Q2 or 3 for most organizations. But who's winning? What's the positional organizational change? Again, here are some things I've noticed. Those organizations that are mission and value focused for their community, not for themselves, but for their community. Those are the ones who are really truly winning. So think outward facing in terms of message, not inward facing. Next on the list is that they are strategic and they do strategic centric work. So they've thought about it. It can be both. It can be tactical. It should be tactical, but it's at a little higher level coming out of pandemic and now dealing with inflation. It's going to be very strategic on what they do, how they do it, why they do it, where they do it, what's it cost. Those are all going to become very important, much more important points, maybe more than we anticipated going into this, coming out of pandemic and going into what we thought would be normal years again. Most organizations are more focused on diversity and inclusion, and that doesn't just mean either on their stages or in their galleries or in their audiences or membership base, but it also means in how they act with partners and which partners they interact with, why that becomes meaningful for all the partnerships and the community. And so those are the ones who are really starting to attract more support, attract more fundraising, attract more investors, and really just attract more curiosity by some. Altogether, it's created a better philanthropic environment for them. When you put these things together, it's created a much better philanthropic environment. It's gotten away from need and it's gotten much more towards vision. And so those are the kinds of organizations who are winning today. They're the ones who align with their community. They promote value-focused work. They're focused on their art. They make their facility notoriously welcome. I'll say that again. They make their facility, whatever it is, notoriously welcoming. That's what we want. Those are the ones who are winning in the biggest ways right now. So looking at launching next year, well, your organization hopefully is going to look similar to this, but most have finished or are about to finish their current fiscal year. I would say by this time next month, everybody's going to be in their new fiscal year or pretty close. The goals for the coming year or the new year that you're in are probably bigger, both in terms of recurring contributed revenue, maybe earned revenue. Some have pulled back a little bit on earned revenue and put most of the weight on contributed. And launching next year's fundraising program early, they know is critical to their success. Question comes about whether or not we should be balancing trying to meet this year's success if you're at the tail end of the fiscal year versus trying to launch successfully for next year or the year that you've just recently been in. Here's what I'll say. In most cases, if I had to sacrifice, first of all, I'll try to balance. But if I have to sacrifice, I'll sacrifice ending the current year successfully to get the jump on next year. Because if I don't, then it's likely I won't. Not only will I not meet this year's goals that I'm about to wrap up, but I'm also jeopardizing next year's goals, which we already have determined are very likely higher than the year that we're wrapping up. So balancing can mean different things. It doesn't mean trying to have victory in both areas for every single organization. You have to analyze that and decide based on your goals, what do we do next? So I've got a few predictions for you. May happen, may not. Very likely we'll all forget about them by the time it comes true at the end of 2025. But let's take a look. First of all, broadening the donor base may be difficult, but patrons will continue to be generous. So broadening the base might be slower. I don't see generosity slowing down. So in other words, I don't see fundraising goals not being met. I don't see those decreasing. Still, I think we'll find a different pathway for generosity than our pre-pandemic, pre-inflationary period was. Number two, value-based stewardship and communication will win the day, and those who ask will receive. We're going to talk about direct asking in just a couple of minutes, but I want to pull out the phrase value-based stewardship. So stewardship can mean you give me money, I give you stuff. But in this case, it doesn't mean that. It means we actually build a solid relationship based on your loving the organization and our appreciating you a great deal for your investments and participation. Much different concept for some organizations. Third, staffing is going to continue to be difficult. I don't see that we've got another 10 months or 12 months of this, and then suddenly the curtains are going to open and throngs of qualified applicants and artists will flood us. I don't think that's going to happen. So in the meantime, the boards have, and many have already, will continue to recommit and re-engage with the institution. They know that victory is important, particularly on the fundraising side, and we can't let anything slow us down, including our ability to find and keep qualified staff members. So we'll see if those come true. I think most of them will. We'll find out in a couple of years here. Some of our best practice responses. So this is what I'm going to go through now. That these are common best practices, but I'm going to apply them to quell inflationary fears, push the recession aside a little bit. Let's talk about how to address that just a little bit with the situation that we find ourselves in right now. First of all, fundraising fundamentals don't change. Again, I've been doing this for 35 years. Most of those charts and that we looked at earlier, I was there as part of that, and I can tell you, I have seen enough ups and downs over time to know that doing the right thing at the right time with the right resources, the right message, et cetera, those fundamentals don't change. That is the pathway, the basic pathway to victory. Second, we want to work the entire donor flywheel. If you don't know what the donor flywheel is it's not something I invented, but it's certainly, as a fundraiser, something I reference very frequently. And that is just in the filter of talking about your prospects and donors. It's about identifying them, cultivating them, soliciting them, and stewarding them, and starting that cycle, working that cycle over and over and over again. In a period like this where inflation is high, where fear might be high, where we want to get to our donors, maybe our donor base has shrunk a little bit. We want to get to the asking, ask. And while asking is important, to ignore the other steps of relationship building will ultimately be to your detriment, probably even in the current fiscal year. So that's why I say work this entire donor flywheel. Number three, lean into your strengths. Don't focus on weak areas. If you're no good at corporate sponsorships, don't try to get good at corporate sponsorships right now. Lean into where you're strong. Lean into individual giving. Lean into multi-year giving. Lean into challenge grant. Wherever you're finding the most strength, continue to lean into that. So I'm not saying don't spend any time in these other areas. I'm saying don't try to fix things that don't work as well when you've got plenty of things that do work very well that you could be utilizing right now. Number four, leaders lead. Volunteers and staff, they have to lead. They have to build relationships with institutions. This is not a time to start writing letters and hiding behind your desk and hoping that people will give. This is a time to engage people at a much higher level, build personal relationships, steward them personally, ask personally. And that's what I term fundraising leadership. This is where the real leaders shine. Balancing your marketing efforts. So even though you might have curbed the curve on coming back and filling seats or having higher attendance or having more participation or having more students in classes or whatever that might look like, you have to balance with the marketing efforts. We're going to have to fundraise more, but we can't do that at the cost of smothering the marketing message. So make sure that there's a balance with the marketing message, the marketing efforts, because ultimately we still want people to consume what we're producing. And we can't do that if we squelch the message, squelch the timing, squelch the frequency. So pay attention to that. I talked a little bit a moment ago about voicing the value. I completely believe in that. Think about taking your message of who you are and turning the mirror outward to your community, and then write your case statement. Don't talk just about all the good things that you are and the great organization that you are. Talk about what it means. And if you can talk about what it means and what's next, if there are new partnerships, if there's a new commitment to expanding diversity and inclusion, whatever that is for your organization, think about what's next and start communicating it. use all, I should have put the word all, use all of your resources here. Please use all of your resources. Staff, volunteers, artists, partners. I mean, those are the common ones. But don't forget about civic groups and media. Be out in front of everybody all the time, as much as you can, sharing good news, value-based good news about your institution. That's what's going to create a buzz about how good things are at your organization, why it's worthy an investment. It will breed confidence. Think a little bit about fiscal overlapping in terms of making decisions, and that's mostly aimed at the donors. So while we might look at fiscal years one after the other, right now, particularly, and in an inflationary period, looking at donors, especially the ones who are, say, $500 and above or $1,000 and above, and thinking about them committing to a multi-year gift, maybe one that's graduated year over year, it goes from 1,000 to 1,500 to 2,000, something like that. This is the time to do it, because then they can be very generous and they can make their commitment. And for some of them, even in an inflationary period, it's very comforting to know that every time they see you, you're not going to be asking them for money. They know what their commitments are. They have plenty of time to plan for them and be a part of your organization in that supportive way. Here's our top 10 productive steps focused on the next 90 days, which was the whole point of this webinar. What can we do in the next 90 days? Number one, it's the most boring one ever, but I'm going to say it, and that is review your goals and your progress in fundraising. You need to know where you stand. Are you ahead or behind last year? Are the goals that you set still reasonable, attainable? I don't, even if they're aspirational, I want them to be aspirational, but I want them to be attainable. And I want you to know how you're going to get to them, particularly in this first 90 days. Because if you miss the first 90 days, you're probably going to miss the rest of the year. So set those goals very aspirationally, plan it out, and know how you're going to get there. Number two, this is how you document how you're going to get there. Create a 90-day tactical plan in place for each one of your divisions of giving. My divisions of giving are usually board, higher level individuals, lower level individuals, then corporations, foundations, government grants, sometimes special events. If it's a recurring special event that you do, like a gala, but you decide what they are and make sure that whatever they are, that you've got a 90-day tactical plan in place, so you know every single step that needs to be taken with every single person or institution over that 90-day period. Number three, line up your lists, your people, your message, your sequence. And again, that's a fundamental, but I'll tell you, most people, most organizations stop with the first thing. They stop by lining up their lists. And they look at lists, and then they look at lists some more, and then they look at lists a little more, and then they change the font and look at them some more. What we're trying to say is lists are important, but they are not the end all be all to make sure that you are on track to get your work done. You need to know who's going to ask. You need to know how much is going to be asked for. You need to know the message. You need to know the sequence of who's going to be asked first versus next after that, based on who's got the most leverage and what makes the most sense, and what's the timing and preference of that donor. So you need to line all those sorts of things up and not just look at lists and say, well, we should ask this person from 5,000 maybe to 7,500. While that's important, it's not ultimately important. It's not enough, not on its own. Number four, set weekly and monthly activity, particularly for your revenue goals, and track those. I hinted at that up on number one and two, but this is where you really want to be sure that you're tracking them. To come back at the end of every week or the beginning of every week, I don't really care as long as it's consistent, and say, are we on track with making these, so that you don't get to day 80 and find out that you've only made 10% of the calls you wanted to make, 10% of the visits you wanted to make. Because if you do that, then you're in real trouble. So that's why the discipline of having these plans in place and the measurements in place will be important for you. Again, commit to person asking. I like to say ask in pairs. That's usually a board member and a staff member, but it can be a staff member and an artist. It can be any combination. But think about person to person asking, if not in face to face, certainly by phone. Though that's a much better way if you think about how do you steward, how do you ask, how do you cultivate people. the more personal interaction you can have, the better. And you're going to need those close relationships, particularly if we can't broaden the base out, like we mentioned earlier. If there's just not enough people as consumers to broaden the donor base, we've got to really recommit ourselves to personalizing our asks and our stewardship with all of our donors who remain. Number 6, create urgency that is not fiscal year driven. Nobody cares about your fiscal year except you. You should care greatly about it, but most other people just don't care. What they do care about are things like challenge grants, recognition deadlines, upcoming programs where they might be recognized as a supporter or sponsor or something along those lines. Think about the positive urgency that you can create so urgency doesn't become a bad word. Think about urgency as being on your toes, not on your heels. And if you use that as your filter, you'll have all sorts of really good ideas about how to create positive urgency. Number 7, the biggest one of those is use a challenge grant from a heroic funding source. So a heroic funding source could be as simple as the board, the collective of your board, each giving a little extra money or committing to giving a little extra money, and you pushing that out as a challenge grant for new money from other donors. And so when you reach it, the board has committed to giving it, they give it, and you use that really positive leverage. So board members who are on this call, I'm sorry for that example, because I know you're probably clutching your wallets right now. But that's just one example. There are other ways to do it as well. Number 8, accelerate asking and remain focused on high leverage, high return. So if someone is fully stewarded, that's a word, someone has been fully stewarded and you feel like it's time to ask, if it's part of the plan to ask them, or if you want to move them up in the asking calendar more than you normally, closer than you normally have, then do it with a good reason, but just remain, if you can accelerate asking and remain focused on the highest leverage, highest return people first, do that. I talked about multi-year asks. In some cases, please do not consider that a single answer for all situations and circumstances. In fact, for many circumstances, it's not the right answer. So be very thoughtful about who and when and why you would approach someone to make a multi-year gift. Number 10, remain flexible to engage your donors, especially via stewardship. So this means meet them where they are. If you have constituents who are not comfortable still with face-to-face meetings, or they're not there geographically close right now, or the timing of when they want to talk to you about fundraising has changed because of inflation or circumstances, or any of those things, just be flexible, because even a slow yes is better than a quick no. And so think about the ones who might be on the edge, or the ones you may not have as much information about. Those are the ones you want to be a little more cautionary with. You want to do a little bit more stewardship with, so that when you do come to the asking table, not only you expect it, but they expect it too, which is kind of nice. All right, last, I think, queuing up here, we have a don't and a do list. And that don't and do list are, don't spend time or money on fundraising. So I'm sorry, don't spend less time or money on fundraising. So if your goals are bigger, right, and you pull back on resources in terms of time, people, money, that's going to be a really terrible recipe for you. So I say, don't spend less time on money and time for fundraising. Number 2, don't stop asking confidently and fearlessly. So even if your organization is having some difficulties in presentations or financial or personnel or whatever those are, don't let that make you pensive in your asking. Think about confidence, and the confidence that the confidence that it breeds in the donor to make an investment in you. And the last don't is, don't be discouraged or pessimistic. So we can all get pessimistic. I go there. Maybe I should just put on here, don't watch the news. Maybe that's a good don't at this point. But in terms of do's, do expect donors to continue to give. Continue to expect generosity. Continue to broaden your donor base, even though it's tough, and I know it's tough, continue to do it. And third, voice your wins. And this is a place where I see most organizations really underperform. So think about any time, just this is the blanket statement. Anytime something is going well, anytime that you have good news to share, a press release should go out, even if you don't necessarily think it's newsworthy. And if it doesn't go out to the media outlets, it should at least go to your donors. And I don't mean pages and pages and pages of electronic garbage they have to sift through. I mean a note that says, "I wanted you to know you're one of my favorite donors, and I wanted you to know that this is happening, and it's in part because of what you have done with the organization. And isn't it great? And don't we all just really appreciate this partnership?" So whatever that looks like, but voice your wins artistically, financially, organizationally, partnership wise. Think about what those are and put that out. It seems like a throwaway kind of action, but it's not. And I'll tell you why. Because here are three things I'll leave you with. I say, first of all, you're either making money or you're making excuses. One's based on action, the other's based on inaction. If you're not raising money even in the previous environment and even in the environment we're going into, it's probably because you're not asking. Number two, this is the confidence one. Confidence most often wins the day. So if you're confident as a presenter of your organization, then your donors are going to be confident. They're going to want to invest. This isn't junior psychology that I'm pushing, but think about your own investments. Think about your own places where you give. You want to give to places that you feel really good about, not the ones that you're deeply, deeply concerned about, wondering if they'll be open long enough to cash your check. And third, communication breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds giving. So make sure, to that last point on the previous slide, communicate, communicate, communicate. That doesn't mean blast them with a fire hose. That's not what I'm saying. This is give them a trickle of information, good news, good news, good news. Think about that with great frequency so that when they think of your organization, they're thinking, these people have their act together. Boy, am I glad that I'm a part of it. And that's what we're aiming for. Okay. All right. Thank you. We've got a few minutes for Q&A. If there's some questions here, and in fact, I will.